The Sound of Dow podcast is also available to listen to on iTunes, Spotify, and Audible. So if you want to listen to your podcast, you can go check it out there. If not, what's up, guys? The second Senate impeachment trial of Donald Trump begins tomorrow. On this podcast, I'm going to give every single reason why I believe Donald Trump is innocent and should not be convicted. Coming right up. All right, how are we all doing, folks? Welcome to the Sound of Dow. So the second Senate impeachment trial of Trump is set to start tomorrow for supposedly inciting an insurrection, which is funny because I always thought insurrections are like armed revolutions that take place with guns. What happened at the Capitol really seems to me more of a riot to me. Like, I think riot is the better word. But, make it seem as big and bad, as scary as possible so that way we can make it sound like Trump literally incited a full-blown revolution in our streets. Yeah, not true. Because if it were true, you'd be seeing it happening. But in this podcast, I'm going to give every single reason why I believe Trump is innocent on these charges and why he should not be convicted. Okay, so this is going to be a counter to everything you're seeing on CNN and, hearing from the Democrats in the trial tomorrow, everything, all of that. So let's get started. There's a plethora of reasons. But to me, obviously, the first reason is this whole trial itself is really not constitutional, in my opinion. According to the Constitution itself, the purpose of impeachment is to impeach and remove the president. How can you remove someone from office who is not in office? How can you remove a president who is not the president? Taking from the language of the Constitution itself, quote, judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. Notice, now the reason they're saying this is still okay is because they're trying to say, well, we're trying to prevent him from holding future office. But notice it says, and disqualification, implying that removal is a part of it. And if you can't remove someone under impeachment because they're not in office, then the very premise of this trial is flawed and unconstitutional. Further, the language of the Constitution itself states that, quote, when the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court shall preside. Now, if you haven't heard, John Roberts has announced that he will not be presiding over this impeachment trial. So we're having an impeachment trial. The Constitution mandates that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over the impeachment trial, but the Chief Justice himself is refusing to preside because he basically believes the whole thing is bogus. Then it's not a constitutional impeachment trial. The Constitution clearly states you need the Chief Justice. So if there's no Chief Justice, no trial here. But quite frankly, I'm not going to talk about this whole argument a lot. You'll probably hear it a lot from the Trump legal team. But to me, this is actually not the best argument. I just wanted to put it out there. But to me, this is not a good argument. And let me tell you why. So we had this argument with Rand Paul's resolution, okay? And we lost that argument ultimately because 55 senators voted that it was constitutional. So this trial is happening regardless, right? And to me, that whole argument is kind of a cope. It's kind of like, well, even though that's not what's going on here, it does give the impression that like, well, we kind of know Trump is guilty, but we're just trying to get around that by saying, hey, look, the very premise of the trial is not constitutional. And honestly, I would prefer not to even talk about that much because I feel like that's sort of a deflection from the actual merits of these charges themselves. And I actually want to talk about these charges because the premise of these charges that are being brought against Trump are fundamentally flawed, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But really quick, I guess the more important argument here is because obviously we know these people don't care about the Constitution, so really bringing up the Constitution is not the best argument. But you notice that over the past 4 years, they've always talked about how Trump is violating our democratic norms and how we need to protect our democratic norms, quote unquote, because our so-called democratic norms are so important. And yet what they are doing with this, and there is genuinely no denying it, is just completely politicizing the impeachment process. It's turning the impeachment process into political circus. And to be fair, we always knew that impeachment was prone to politicization. It's just the nature of the process, and there is no getting around it. But we are supposed to try to avoid politicizing impeachment. And impeaching people that have already left office, right? Because the purpose of impeachment was meant to be if a president was an open danger, sitting president was an open danger, and it's like, we need to get this person out of office, or this person has committed serious crimes and needs to be removed immediately. That was what it was for. It was not meant to posthumously punish and just get back at someone you didn't like leaving office. And they always talk about democratic norms and protecting our institutions from politicization and stuff like that. I mean, this impeachment trial is a banana republic crap. I mean, it's third world crap. It's trying to take political vengeance, and as much as they talk about a peaceful transition of power, and that is the tradition in America. Like once the past president is gone, he's gone, and the new administration just moves on, and that's the exact opposite of what we're seeing here, okay? And so for people so concerned with our democratic norms, it's extremely odd to see them cheering as democratic norms are blatantly broken with all of this. But anyways, all that stuff out of the way, let's actually assess the merits of these charges themselves. Did President Trump incite an insurrection on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th? Well, let's take a look at what they're saying. Let's take a look at their argument for all of this. So they're claiming that the speech he made on the White House ellipse, which began prior to the Capitol Hill riot, was what incited the Capitol Hill riot. But it's important to point out the obvious. When President Trump asked his supporters to march over to the Capitol, he was not promoting people are acting like he was promoting some spontaneous event. No one was planning to go to the Capitol before, and then he said, go to the Capitol, and then everyone stormed over there like an angry mob. Okay, let's be clear about what was actually happening on January 6th. There were a multitude of planned events, planned peaceful protests throughout that whole day. Okay, and the schedule was you would be at the White House ellipse. Trump was going to speak at about 11 a.m., and there was already a rally planned at the Capitol long before Trump said anything about the Capitol. As a matter of fact, that was what President Trump was promoting himself. An already planned out peaceful protest event at the Capitol that was already scheduled to take place. So for people who pretend like he just randomly sent a bunch of people to the Capitol, that's not true. Everyone who was a Trump supporter and who was in D.C. knew that there was going to be this massive event at the Capitol because the plan was, okay, I'm telling you right now, folks, the plan was for the peaceful protesters to start at the ellipse, listen to Trump speak, march over to the Capitol, protest outside in front of the Capitol. And by the way, another important detail that day, Trump's speech that day began at about 12. It started almost a whole hour late. And people left, a bunch of people, like I'm not just talking about a small amount of people, but a bunch of people left in the middle of Trump's speech to head over to the Capitol, okay? And among the crowd of those very first people who left were the people who started the storming of the Capitol, who started the riot. Okay, so if Trump was what caused this, Trump is what's to blame for this? If Trump's speech, it was all because of Trump's speech. Why would the people who actually started the riot itself leave in the middle of Trump's speech if they're listening to dear leader Trump here and not acting on their own merits? You also have many intelligence reports that state that the specific group of people who were storming the Capitol that day, that started it all, were planning days in advance to storm the Capitol. So how could it be Trump's energetic speech that caused the riot when these people were acting entirely on their own accord? And then in terms of Trump's speech itself, how much clearer can you get than peacefully and patriotically?
We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully slated. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Today we will see whether Republicans stand strong for integrity of our election.
Guys, I don't see why this is even a debate. A politician called for a peaceful protest outside a government building during a very important and significant event. Is that some far out outlandish thing? Peaceful protests occur outside the U.S. Capitol on basically a daily basis. And straight up, he called for peace. So what is the standard that is being set here? Oh, that speech is violence. That's basically what the standard they're setting here. Speech is violence, even when that speech does not call for violence. As a politician, here's the standard that it appears to be setting, which is a standard that is rebuked by a century of Supreme Court rulings on the First Amendment. This is the standard that's being set here. The standard that's being set is that anytime a politician has supporters who commit acts of violence, that politician is to blame. Now, that's an extremely dangerous standard to set and basically kills the entire idea of free speech because, hey, what you said might be used by someone else to commit violence. Even if you call for peace, even if you say do it peacefully, just because that person supports you, you are automatically guilty of inciting violence. But if we're going to run by that standard, and you knew this was coming, if we are going to run by that standard, then most Democrats in the House of Representatives and the Senate are guilty of the same exact thing Trump is. Because apparently, if this is the standard that we're setting here, anytime a politician holds a rally or endorses some type of protest that ultimately turns violent, that is violence. You might look at this and be like, hold on, wait a minute. And that's exactly it. Hold on, wait a minute. So would that suggest that in 2017, when a Bernie Sanders supporter went and didn't just unarmed to try to beat up Congress people, but actually went up to Republican members of Congress and shot at them, literally actually hit Steve Scalise, nearly killed Steve Scalise with a gun? When that Bernie Sanders supporter did that, was Bernie Sanders guilty of that action? Because again, this is the standard we're setting. Any politician is responsible for their supporters' actions, even if they don't call for that violence, because they had charged rhetoric, because they said fight like hell. So, okay, so does that mean that because Bernie Sanders has a lot of radical rhetoric, radically speaks out against Republicans, because Bernie Sanders says mean things about Republicans sometime, is the standard we're setting that Bernie Sanders is to blame for the congressional baseball shooter? Oh, but it gets far worse than whatever Bernie has said over his career. Remember this, folks, from Maxine Waters herself?
If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome.
How about when Nancy Pelosi incites insurrection herself by saying that she's surprised that there's not uprisings all across the country?
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country, and maybe there will be when people realize that this is a policy that they defend.
Now, I've been listening to Democrats and to the media and trying to gather what exactly it is that Trump said that they believe this is what incited the insurrection. And I've basically, this is what I've universally heard, which is when Trump says we gotta, quote, fight like hell. Okay, because he says if we don't fight like hell, then we're not going to have a democracy left to save. That was the incitement to violence, saying we have to get out there and fight. Are we just going to... I'm very confused by this standard. Quite frankly, I'm very confused by it. Because that would suggest that, like, every time a politician says you got to stand up, you got to fight for your rights, which is what politicians on both sides say on a regular basis, that is the incitement of violence? By that standard, by saying we got to fight like hell to save our democracy, by that standard, like everything the Democrats have said over the past 4 to 5 years could strongly be considered an incitement to violence. Not just what Nancy Pelosi was saying about uprisings, not what just Maxine Waters was saying by you get out, literally saying, and I quote, you get out and you form a crowd and you surround people who work in the Trump cabinet, which is like far worse than anything freaking Trump is saying here, okay? But beyond that, if saying we got to go out and fight for our democracy because our democracy is under siege, our democracy is being threatened by the other party, that's the incitement of violence. Like you're saying that the other side is a threat to democracy? Hold on a minute, folks. The what? So saying the other side is threatening our democracy, that's the incitement to violence. Dude, they have universally labeled Donald Trump as a fascist, as Hitler, as the grand threat to our democracy for the past 4 years. Everything I hear about Trump, every other sentence from politicians, from media figures, you name it, he's a threat to our democracy. He's destroying our democracy. The Washington Post slogan under the Trump presidency was literally, democracy dies in darkness. So literally at every single turn, these people the past 4 years have been saying that President Trump is killing, and we have to get out there and fight for democracy. But yet, when President Trump says the same exact thing that they've been saying the past 4 years, that's not free speech, that's an incitement to violence. And by the way, all of that anti-Trump rhetoric has not happened with any shortage of violence committed by the left, okay? With any shortage of violence against Trump supporters. You have all these Trump supporters who were assaulted, hurt, some were killed over the past 4 years. As an indirect result, arguably, in the same way you'd make this argument that Trump incited the riots, as an indirect result of Democratic rhetoric. BLM, the BLM and Antifa, does that even need an explanation? And yet apparently their counter-argument to all of this is that, well, it's different because he's the president, and it's different because you can't compare BLM because BLM was burning down stores and these people stormed the Capitol. What kind of standard is that? Okay, incitement to violence is incitement to violence. Violence is violence. It doesn't matter to what scale it happens or who the violence is against. In terms of law, and maybe in terms of public opinion, you're like, well, this is worse than this. But in terms of law, in legal court, there has to be some type of objective standard as to what incitement to violence is and what violence is, okay? The rules don't suddenly change when you're the president. Guess what? The First Amendment applies to the president too. So if everything, the media and everything, all other elected officials have said about Trump supporters, about Trump these past 4 years, if that is protected speech, if that's free speech, that's political speech. But because he's the president saying the exact same thing, that's not political speech? What legal basis is that? Show me where in the Constitution or where in any legal doctrine it says the president of the United States has different codes for what free speech is than the rest of everyone else. That's not how this works. You have to have some type of objective standard as to what incitement to violence is. And if violence results from that, you have to treat it equally. Okay? You can't just ignore, see, this violence occurred because of this politician, but it was smaller scale than this violence, so we take the larger scale, we pay attention to the larger scale one, but totally ignore the smaller scale? Not only is it like, not as much of an impeachable offense, but it's literally, it doesn't exist. Like, it just straight up doesn't exist. That is no standard to go off of. That standard makes absolutely no sense here. And most of all, we already knew this, but now we're seeing with our own eyes in real time just how little these people actually have any regard for the concept of what free speech is in this country. Because here's what I've been seeing from them in the past 48 hours. Since they know that talking about that speech on the White House's lips on January 6th is not really the best argument because there's a pretty clear and obvious tape of Trump saying, quote, peacefully and patriotically protest. Now they're going back further than that. Now they are saying that, well, it wasn't just because of what Trump said on January 6th. It's the very fact itself that Trump questioned the election results at all. Check out this clip from our lovely friends over at CNN.
What they're trying to do on the Trump impeachment team, Brooke, is to create some distance between the president and what took place at the Capitol on January 6th. They are saying when he said things like you have to fight like hell, that he was talking about his election concerns, which is interesting because it is sort of a sly way for these Trump lawyers to inject the big lie that the president has been peddling for months now, that the election was stolen from him. Many of these lawmakers were going through when they felt like their lives were threatened to sort of put the president on trial from the standpoint that members of Congress's lives were put at stake, were put in jeopardy by virtue of what the president said on January 6th. The Trump impeachment team is trying to say no. The president was just talking about his concerns about the election results. But of course, that again goes back to this big lie that the president has peddled over and over again, that somehow the election was stolen from him, when of course we all know it wasn't, Brooke.
Yep. The other thing, and Jim talked about this, they do not disavow the big lie. They keep the door open in this brief to argue the big lie. They say, well, there's evidence both ways. Who can say? The quote is, they say, Donald Trump therefore denies that his statements about the stolen election were false. So they're keeping the door open to that, I think, very dangerous argument.
You hear that, folks? Questioning election results is incitement to violence. Questioning election results is not free speech. It's not protected speech. By the way, you know, that's a really great way to make people believe that you didn't rig the election. Like, make it illegal to question the election results. Oh yeah, clearly we have nothing to hide here, guys. Yeah. Okay. But you hear that, guys? You hear that? You hear that standard? We're not even talking about the January 6th speech anymore. Now we're saying that the very fact that Trump questioned the election results itself, that is an incitement to violence. It is not free speech to question the results of an election. Keeping aside just how dangerous these standards are. I mean, wait a minute. What? What happened 4 years ago? What's happened for the past 4 years? I mean, you have Hillary Clinton literally said outright, okay? She said outright that the election was stolen from her. Same thing as Donald Trump, okay? Like, again, these people are guilty of incitement of violence by their own standards, okay? And I know it's easy to say, well, obviously they have double standards. Obviously they believe in a one-party state, and that's true. But luckily, we have something called the Constitution, and nowhere in the First Amendment does it say, well, this thing right here, this only applies to Democrats. No, okay? under what we consider to be political speech, and wherever you want to draw that line, I mean, there's a pretty clear legal standard. If we're going off of the legal precedent that the Supreme Court has set as to what is protected speech and what is political speech, Trump is easily innocent. But whatever standard we're going to create based on political speech has to be an equal standard. Okay? Not because the Democrats want it to be, because the Constitution requires it to be. And every single thing they have said as to, well, this incited violence, that incited violence, every single thing, without fail, can easily be used against them in the fact that they've said the exact same thing at an earlier point. And left-wing violence, well, there's been no shortage of that the past year, the past 4 years. And they'd probably respond to that with a reasonable response to say, well, this is like a country of 323 million people. We're not responsible for what every single person who supports us does. We don't call for that. We don't endorse that. Well, guess what, folks? Neither does President Trump, neither did President Trump. But if we're creating these standards, you are guilty by every single metric. And by the way, there is no legal basis for those standards, okay? Because what the Supreme Court throughout the decades has defined as, well, this is protected political speech, this is an incitement to violence. What Trump said under basically all legal precedent in this country would easily be considered to be protected speech. But if we're going to throw that out, at least create some type of standard that is equal to everyone, because again, the Constitution requires that. It doesn't just let you create these different rules for people. I mean, it's as simple as that, really. A lot of people used to think it was sort of like right-wing propaganda. They're going to create hate speech codes if they take power. They're going to literally be infringing on free speech. But you heard it now here. I mean, people are now saying out in the open, that questioning the results of an election, Jim Acosta saying this on national TV, and, you know, they're not far away from the Biden administration. They're not away from the actual politicians in power. You literally have these people saying on national TV that questioning the results of an election is not free speech. And then what's next? Every right wing, every conservative opinion soon enough is going to be considered an incitement to violence. You believe in lower taxes, incitement to violence. You believe in restricting immigration, incitement to violence, hate speech. It's coming way faster than you think, folks. It's no longer is it some right-wing out there talking point. It's true. These people have no regard for free speech. They have no regard to the First Amendment, and they are trying as hard as possible to define every conservative viewpoint further to the right of Mitt Romney as not protected political speech. And that's what's going on here. For now, you might see that standard only being applied to President Trump, but I guarantee you, I'm next, you're next, we're all next. Okay? Because obviously it's like, well, if Trump says this and it incites violence, then wouldn't it also mean that if this person says this that also incites violence, throw them in jail for inciting insurrection? That's what's happening next, you know? And of course, it's a one-party state thing. They always talk about how Trump is like a third-world dictator, but really it's they that are third-world dictators. Because they've created unequally enforced, imbalanced rules regarding political speech itself. How very dangerous. How very authoritarian. Anyways, folks, that'll do it here for this podcast. We're going to be streaming definitely tomorrow night and probably Wednesday and Friday night, most likely as well. Following the impeachment trial, we'll give you sort of the rundown on what happened, our thoughts, our recap. We'll probably get some guests on it. So be sure to stay tuned on this YouTube channel. We're going to have a lot of streams and stuff coming. But until next time, until then, remember, if you're listening on iTunes, be sure to give it a 5-star rating. If you're listening on Spotify, be sure to subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and leave a nice comment. Until then, remember, folks, alpha moves only. I'll see you guys next time. Peace. Hey, buddy, if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and be sure to click the links down in my description for my Telegram channel, other social medias, and all that good stuff, you name it, okay?